Hey, Macedonia. I hope you all are doing well and are enjoying the weather today. It's warmed up and it looks like we are on the verge of full on spring into summer. So that's, I think the forecasts were for 80s coming up. And, I know there's a lot going on. In fact, I have my window open, so you'll hear some background noise from outside, cars on the road, whatnot. But I'm just enjoying some of the wonderful fresh air that comes along with this time of year, enjoying it mightily. But we're here. We are again Wednesday. Things are starting to open up, restaurants and other things that are going on, but we find ourselves still unable to gather at church. And so, I want to continue to share scripture with you and encourage you. I'm having such a wonderful time doing the services, with Lee and Dwayne and everybody at church on Sunday mornings, and so excited to see everyone there. It's just been wonderful, even though it's a little different, and it's exciting because I've seen now that other churches have done the same thing. In fact, I think Keystone this coming Sunday is planning on trying a similar type of service. They've been recording theirs and putting them online, but we talking with Nate, and he was inspired by our radio broadcast. So I think we're gonna go that, or they're gonna try going that route. So I thought that was neat. We finished up Jonah last week, and thought where to go from there. And uh, Katie had made a great suggestion. She said, "Why not do James?" It's one of my favorite books. I just actually, if you go back, I did recently, a few weeks ago, did a quick uh, devotion. We'll call it on chapter one of James, but it might be fun to go in a little deeper into the chapters. There's 5 chapters in James, so we could spread this out over a few weeks. Have some interesting dialogue, at least in one way here, and feel free to respond, email, send me a comment, or anything else. Post these on YouTube. You can comment there. I hope more people see them than just the church. I love you all. And I want you to get something out of this. But one of the reasons that I post it to YouTube is because I do hope somebody else finds them and gets something of value out of these conversations, as I like to think of it. Uh, it's weird to be sitting in front of a camera and having this conversation, instead of to a group of people. It changes the way you approach it, but you have to. One of the things to think about is how do you break down the wall, and which, whether you realize it or not, there's a wall here between us. You're on the other side of the camera, and how do you cross over that and really engage people? So we'll work through it. We'll do our best and continue to press on. But I'm going to pick up James, and we're going to start studying that. It's, again, I mentioned it's one of my favorites. We're going to not tackle the whole chapter. We'll see how far I get. My goal is the first 16 verses, because I feel like that's a kind of an interesting dividing line that recently in reading it occurred to me, the way the verses fit together. I don't want to take anything out of context, but there's an immense number of great one-liners inside of the book of James. In fact, you can see from reading it his inspiration, and to give a little backstory, so James here being, we believe, the half brother of Jesus, second born, I've read, and obviously people will have different perspectives on that, but generally accepted he was Jesus's younger brother and the leader of the church in Jerusalem. So that would have been really the first church, and led it for many years until he was martyred. And so this is a book. It's a letter, is how it's identified. It's really, in some respects, a sermon, but it is you kind of, one of the best ways to read is to pick it up and read it through like you would a letter. But there are so many, again, one-liners, just so many little tidbits in here. It's chock full. So from an inspiration perspective, you see much of Jesus' teaching from the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew, I believe, 5-7, chapters 5-7. And I'll reference some of those as we get into the later chapters. And then also Proverbs 1-9. So you see some of the little tidbits in here that really reflect back to what Proverbs was and what Proverbs taught. And there's lots of in here about wisdom, which also is from Proverbs. But I've heard it described, and I think I've mentioned this before, that James can be viewed as a kind of a micro version of the gospel. But it's just think of it as the concentrated version. That's the word I'm trying to think of. You get the detergent, and then you've got the concentrated detergent. But he tries to capture and put forth the nuggets that we need. In some respects, you could almost think of this as a small version. The pocket version. You could roll it up and put it in your pocket if we were talking about scrolls, and carry it around with you. So there's a little backstory on James. The book itself, again, not very long, and we'll step through it here, hopefully at a reasonable pace. I'm going to try to keep these videos to about 20 minutes each. I know, at least for me, that's about my attention span on a video, and much longer than that, and it starts to get challenging. So I'll do my best. No promises, but that's what we're going for. So we start off, and if you're reading along, just for reference, I'm using the NASB version, New American Standard Bible. In my reading, just the language is a little bit easier to pull apart and discuss. James chapter 1. James, a bondservant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes who are dispersed abroad, greetings. Consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And let endurance have its perfect result, so that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. But if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all generously and without reproach, and it will be given to him. But he must ask in faith, without any doubting, for the one who doubts is like the surf of the sea, driven and tossed by the wind. For that man ought not to expect that he will receive anything from the Lord, being a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. That's the first 8 verses, and I'll pause there. James intros and opens this up. He doesn't have a greeting like we would see from Paul as much, where he were writing to a church or to a specific group, because he identifies himself. As a bondservant of God and of Lord Jesus Christ. And then he addresses it to the 12 tribes who are dispersed abroad, because keep in mind, at this time, most of the Christians were Jews. And it was quickly changing. The word was spreading rapidly. But what we read in a few chapters in the Bible, we tend to forget took years. Paul, we read about Saul's conversion and his, when he go to the mission field, we often gloss over and miss entirely the fact that Paul went off and studied for almost a decade. And he was, before he even really got into the ministry. Now, we don't know what he was doing. I believe he was probably absolutely witnessing and testifying, but God refined him for many years. And so the things that we see transpire over the book of Acts, which you can read in not very long, you can read in one sitting, if you're patient enough, looks like it transpired quickly to us, but it was over the course of many years. And so we have to keep that in context. But again, at this time, he's addressing the 12 tribes, but the writing here is for everyone. It's, he's trying to give encouragement and wisdom and guidance to the tribes and to the other Jews, but he is talking to Christians everywhere. And he makes references here throughout the chapter to, he talks about brothers, and it's not specifically Jewish brethren or blood related. It's this brotherhood. We refer to each other as brothers and sisters in Christ, and that was his reference. He talks about an interesting thing here in verse 2, and I don't want to lean too hard on applying it to the situation we're in, because I don't think that that this is necessarily something I'm trying to get to is not a message for our time in COVID. Although, like many things, what we're going through is a trial, and it is honing and refining us. It's making us realize what's important. And so this does apply in some respects, but my point here is not to try to pull everything back and say, oh, this is because this is a message directly for our situation. If it applies to something you're dealing with, then it is a message for your situation. To me, the entire Bible is that. A verse can one day not apply to me, and the next day apply perfectly to my situation. I attribute that to God's wisdom and His infinite goodness, in that He has all of those things in there for such a time as this, if you will. But he says here that it's joys, which is one of those things that seems absurd, and I'll hearken again back to many of the things Jesus said, and what often gets referred to as the upside down kingdom, because the kingdom that Jesus brought and that we live in, whether we realize it or not, is one very much of an upside down nature. And the kingdom, we don't think of trials as joyful, but when you think of what trials produce in us, and he gets to that, and he says, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance, and let endurance have its perfect result, so you may be perfect, complete, lacking in nothing. Think of and the illustration I like here is gold. Gold is not something that you would normally see as immensely desired. It looks like it's a golden rock. In fact, you see pyrite, which is not a valuable mineral, and it gets mistaken. Gold in nature can be dirty and full of impurities and not immensely valuable in its natural form. It has to be refined. And so oftentimes you'll hear refined in fire like gold as something that we see, because it's one of those metals that is, once it has been refined, is immensely desirable. And this is what God desires for us. He is constantly working at us and allowing trials to come and putting us in situations that are incredibly uncomfortable, because not only does He want to remove the impurities, our bad habits, and our things that draw us away from Him, but He wants us to be pure, and the only way to do that is to burn away the impurities. It's not necessarily pleasant. Personally, I've gone through a number of things that are challenging, that I struggle with, and such as my anxiety that I've been dealing with the last few months, unrelated to COVID. Timing was impeccable. Just it's crazy how things work out. But the struggle of dealing with something completely out of my sphere of knowledge, like I didn't understand what it was that I was dealing with, or how it's impacting. And I'm still trying to figure some of that out, and what it means for me and what it does to me is something that I didn't realize initially was purifying me. It helped me realize I could not depend on myself. I had to depend on God. And at the same time, it is so frustrating, but yet so liberating, because I have come to realize that my worth and my value is completely independent of my state of mind or what I've done. God's love for me is not dependent on how powerful or successful I am, how strong I can be. So all of those things end up causing me to be very reassured rather than anxious. And again, back to that upside down kingdom. I certainly lack wisdom, I feel like, most days, and I don't normally feel like a trial is something to be joyful about. I'm slowly learning, and it's again a work in progress. I reminded myself recently that Moses took 80 years before he got around to doing what God was calling him to. Some of it was by his own choice, and some of it was by God shaping him into who he needed to be. So by that measure, I'm just barely halfway there. So, and then he goes on in verses 6, 7, and 8, and talks about the way we ask, and asking in faith without doubting. It seems so hard sometimes, because for me at least, I feel doubts creep up immediately. It's almost like when I ask something, I immediately begin to make excuses for God about why He's not going to answer my prayer, when in many cases it's probably because I'm not asking for the thing that I need, which is another realization I've come to lately, is that the things that happen and the things that I receive, and no matter what, good, what I would perceive good, bad, or call otherwise is the best thing that God has for me. If I go through hardship and struggle, I have resolved myself that that's the best thing God has for me. If I have a setback, or suffer an anxiety attack, or get scared about something, and He doesn't immediately respond, like I pray and I say, "Hey, Lord, free me from this." No, maybe I'm asking the wrong thing. Maybe I need to let go and trust Him. And ultimately, I do trust that what comes out of that in the end is the best possible thing. And that's when it talks about doubting. You just don't doubt that God has the best for you. It absolutely, He's unchanging. He knows what's best, and He will always be pursuing you for the best possible outcome. Just remember that best as we define it and best as God defines it is not the same, and His ideas are so much beyond ours that we can't fathom them. Now, that sets up an interesting scenario, because as we go into the latter verses here and unpack it some more, think about it in those terms, that God's best and our best are not necessarily one and the same. It says in verse 9, "But the brother of humble circumstances is to glory in his high position." That doesn't match with anything that we understand. However, it matches perfectly with "the meek shall inherit the kingdom of heaven." And those lessons from the Beatitudes and the Sermon on the Mount, that aligns perfectly with God's kingdom. "And the rich man is to glory in his humiliation, because like flowering grass he will pass away." Verse 10, we don't we know that the grass passes away. Here we are moving into spring. The daffodils are gone. They've faded quickly. The iris are here now. They're beautiful. The daisies are blooming. Before long, they're going to be gone. So just as we know that God provides for them and gives them everything they need, their time also passes. That the reality is that if they don't, there won't be seeds for next year, and the renewal won't come next spring. This idea that the way we measure success is not the way God does, and I think that's an affirmation of that. Verse 11. And we're gonna. It continues this idea. "For the sun rises with a scorching wind and withers the grass, and its flower falls off, and the beauty of its appearance is destroyed. So too the rich man in the midst of his pursuits will fade away." And this verse makes me think of the rich man who was going to tear down his barns and build bigger barns, and God came to him and said, "Tonight your soul will be required of you," and it was over. He, was in the midst of his pursuits, and how often does that happen? And we don't understand and we don't know, but again, we trust the Lord. The last few verses, I'm going to cover 13 through 16 here, and I think I'll put a bow on it or a pin in it there, and we'll stop because of time, and it's a good stopping spot. The verse 12, and I'm going to read. Let's see here. I'll kind of pick these apart one at a time. "Blessed is the man who perseveres under trial, for once he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life which the Lord has promised to those who love him." I like the ESV actually says, "Blessed is the man who perseveres under trial, for when he has stood the test." Again, both mean the same thing. Approved, meaning you have stood the test and you've essentially passed, I think, of quality control in passing the test, and you're approved. But this is showing that, again, trials produce something in us, and they produce a quality in us that is something the Lord desires. And so much as we receive the crown of life. So we remain steadfast and we persevere under trial for those reasons. And then the last 13 through 16 here, I like. I'm gonna bundle them together, because I've always had a bit of a struggle reading verse 16. It's so short, but it's kind of a pivot, and I've always attached it for some reason to verse 17. And recently, reading here, I read it in a different way, that I tied it to verse 16 as just a cautionary note. cadence, the way I read it, I don't know, but something that recently just struck me differently, which is always, I think, I always enjoy that when something kind of a light bulb goes off when I'm reading scripture and have a moment of realization. God probably appreciates when I get my head on straight and have a moment of realization too, because he's probably been waiting patiently for me to get the idea. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted by evil, and he himself does not tempt anyone. It's just the unchanging nature of God. We know these truths about God, and I love to be grounded in that God cannot lie, he cannot change, and he is not tempted by evil. That is a fixed point of reference. But each one is tempted when he is carried away and enticed by his own lust. Then, when lust is conceived, it gives birth to sin, and when sin is accomplished, it brings forth death. And in verse 16, do not be deceived, my beloved brethren. Now, I'm going to stop there. If you go on, it gets into some other things, and I've always, again, which I associated that, do not be deceived, my beloved brethren, about the following verses, but I took it this time when I was studying as a follow-on note to verses 14 and 15, 13, 14, and 15 there. We're tempted not by God, but it's our own lusts that tempt us. It's the desires, and at its very core, it's our desire to be in control and to not want to turn everything over to God that undermines us. You can look at many of our sins, the pride and sexual sins and things that we go after from a money perspective or security or safety, all the things that can be idols for us and draw us away from God. Oftentimes come back to our own sense and desire and need for control. And one of the hardest things to do is to relinquish control to God. But when we do that, we experience a freedom that we don't understand. And this is why I like this in verse 16 where it says, do not be deceived, my beloved brethren, because that's what sin is. Sin is deceit. It lures us in and tells us that we'll get what we want, that we will get all the things that we desire if we give in to sin. And the fact of the matter is, and this is why it's deceit, is because it's the exact opposite. We know in the Bible that sin is slavery and bondage, and we will, the deeper we get into sin, as much as we think it's going to give us control and freedom, it binds us more and more tightly. And the only way to be free is to release control absolutely to God. And it is absurd for us. It is from our way of thinking, from our mentality, our worldview, our sinful nature, all of those things conspire against us to tell us that giving up control and being out of control are the same thing, and those are not. Giving up control, relinquishing control to the God of the universe who controls everything, is the ultimate control, because he will do it perfectly, and we can be free of that burden. And as someone who has carried around many burdens that I shouldn't over the years, and I struggle every day to lay those burdens down, to die to myself, and I'm still so far from figuring that out. But not deceiving myself and allowing myself to be controlled or thinking that I'm in control has been something that I've been working through for a long time. But don't be deceived. Don't be deceived by the world that tells you that that sin is the way out, or that the things of the world are the way out. God is the only way, and we will get into that some more about the nature of God and what God is in the rest of chapter 1 next week. So I am praying for you. I hope to see you all soon, and I hope you're having a wonderful day. God bless.